Good evening and welcome to INFOWARS Nightly News on this April 20, 2012 edition. I'm your host, Paul Joseph Watson.
Tonight on the INFOWARS Nightly News, our story on mandatory black boxes in cars is making waves in the mainstream media. Paul Joseph Watson covers this, and he shows you the law where by 2015, every car in America will have a black box that will track and trace you. Plus, 29 ways the government is now wasting your money. Included in that list, studying why chimps throw poop. Also, new insights of CIA involvement in the JFK assassination, like we didn't know that already. And Rob Dew sits down with Stuart Rhodes, head of Oath Keepers, to discuss the NDAA and other ways our freedoms are being taken. All this and more on the INFOWARS Nightly News. We take you now to London, England, and Paul Joseph Watson.
Okay, folks, let's get straight to the news. First headline tonight, bill allowing IRS to revoke passports described as, quote, Stalinist. The Moving Ahead for Progress in the 21st Century Act, MAP 21, is so crammed full of unconstitutional provisions that even the mainstream media is up in arms, with an Investor's Business Daily editorial describing the section that allows the IRS to revoke passports of accused tax delinquents as, quote, Stalinist. And this, of course, is the legislation, or at least one part of it. We'll go on to discuss others later, which empowers the IRS to suspend travel rights of American citizens simply accused of owing $50,000 or more in back taxes to the IRS. And you've heard our take on it over the past week or so. This is what Investors Business Daily, a prominent mainstream newspaper, had to say. Quote, it is hard to imagine any law more reminiscent of the Soviet Union that America toppled or its Eastern Bloc slave satellites. That's not me saying that. That's not Alex Jones saying that. That's a typically mainstream middle-of-the-road newspaper saying that. And they go on basically to describe this IRS provision as the biggest threat to mobility rights since the domination of Eastern Europe by the Communist Party. And the Berlin Wall. And it's basically, they say, a recreation of Stalin's internal passport system whereby Soviet comrades weren't allowed to leave their area of residence without permission from the government. And this is what's being drafted into law under this new bill if it gets past the House. Quote, there remain few things more prized than American citizenship, yet now our ever-expanding leviathan of a government is forcing Americans abroad out, and it might soon build its own Berlin Wall, restricting our freedom of world travel, as Reagan put it, even when there is no conviction from a court, states the editorial. And they make the connection, of course, that the recent news that Americans in record numbers are renouncing their citizenship for this exact reason, the Feds prying into their financial affairs. And this ties into our next story, which is about the same bill. Forbes writer scoffs at INFOWARS freak out on mandatory black boxes. And so, as you've read, we've reported this week on the mandatory event data recorders that are also in this MAP 21 legislation that includes the IRS empowerment to revoke passports. And in subsequent articles on the matter, we explored the fact that we know these black boxes are already in most new vehicles, aside from a few manufacturers. I mean, Alex Jones has been talking about this since the 1990s. The point is they're trying to make them mandatory now because this is how they're going to implement the carbon tax by the mile system, which, you know, the Obama administration has been pushing for years. This is how they will generate the automatic speeding fines and charge it directly to your bank account. You know, fines for not wearing your seatbelt, insurance premiums going up based on these fines. This is all going to be recorded by this black box. That's the point of it. Total invasion of privacy. But this trendy at Forbes magazine called Kashmir Hill, this so-called privacy expert, who, if you read a blog, actually couldn't care less for privacy, she comes out with this sniveling piece. Hate to break it to you, but your car likely has a black box spying on you already. Which we already knew the fact. But she basically accuses us of, freaking out, and then says, unbelievably, that Map 21 is, quote, good for privacy. That's right, good for privacy, according to this Forbes writer. I mean, it empowers the IRS to share your intimate financial information with the TSA and US immigration authorities. It implements this mandatory black box to track where you go, how far you drive, imposes fines and penalties if you deactivate it. And it also lays the groundwork, as I also covered, for this vehicle-to-infrastructure communication system, which is basically a bug implanted in your car. It works, or will work, with these IntelliStreets light poles that have got computer systems that broadcast two-way information. They've also been slated to be used to listen to conversations. So all this is going to be hooked into this black box tracker, as well as the vehicle to infrastructure communication systems. But according to this trendy at Forbes, it's good for privacy. The bill is good for privacy, even though it destroys privacy. So I guess that's why CIA Chief David Petraeus recently bragged that the government wouldn't have to bother implanting a bug in your house or your car, because the people were doing it to themselves through this Internet of Things, of which your car will become a part once this bill gets through. So again, Forbes writer Kashmir Hill says it's good for privacy when it destroys your privacy. I mean, it's obvious she hasn't even read the bill. She doesn't even mention IRS revoking passports or the two-way bug implants. But to their credit, some other journalists and columnists in the mainstream media are giving this subject its proper dues, which we'll now explore. Meet the bill that wants to put plane-like black boxes in our cars. This is Megan Garger out of The Atlantic. INFOWARS Paul Joseph Watson reading through section 31406 of the Moving Ahead for Progress in the 21st Century Act, Map 21 bill that's currently making its way through Congress, made a nice catch. The bill calls for, quote, mandatory event data recorders to be installed in all new vehicles starting in the year 2015. So, it's nice to be given credit by some journalists, and they're actually recognizing the threat that this bill poses to privacy. After our article on Wednesday, it was also mentioned in the Business Insider, and now it seems that this black box tracking system is starting to get more and more attention. So hopefully the resistance to this bill will begin to build to a crescendo, because at the moment it's going to sail through the House with barely a whimper of protest. So the fact that it's getting more and more attention is a good thing. For the purposes of trying to stop it from getting passed. Moving on, spy drones over America. Lawmakers demand answers on privacy safeguards, by Steve Watson. A bipartisan pair of congressmen joined forces Thursday to put important questions to the Federal Aviation Administration regarding the agency's plans to open up American skies to thousands of surveillance drones. They've also actually now, after a threat of lawsuit, published this map which shows you which states have given permission for these surveillance drones to be used in. Hawaii has barred it, and there are also a handful of other US states that have prevented refused to grant permission for these surveillance drones to be flown in those particular states. So basically, these congressmen have written a letter to the FAA asking how this relates to privacy, how it's going to violate people's privacy. But, I guess if we listen to the trendies over at Forbes, the same people who say Bill Gates is a hero and drones used to hunt insurgents in Afghanistan are, good for privacy, I guess, then I suppose that the mass use of drones in law enforcement is good for privacy. I mean, that's the new trendy double think. Everything that destroys privacy is in fact good for privacy. That's what the trendies say over at Forbes. Moving on, climate alarmist calls for burning down skeptics' homes. And this is actually featured over the Drudge Report today as one of their top headlines. And once again, eco-fascism raises its ugly head. And this is Steve Zwick writing for, you guessed it, Forbes magazine once again. Destroying privacy is good for privacy. And basically he says, if you dare to challenge the brainwashing on climate change, then your house should be allowed to burn to the ground. Quote, "We know who the active denialists are, not the people who buy the lies, mind you, but the people who create the lies. Let's start keeping track of them now. And when the famines come, let's make them pay. Let's let their houses burn. Let's swap their safe land for submerged islands. Let's force them to bear the cost of rising food prices." Right, Zwick, adding, "They broke the climate. Why should the rest of us have to pay for it?" So again, the alarmists have lost the debate. The polls show belief in man-made global warming is plummeting. And the alarmists have resorted to using threats and intellectual coercion because the pseudoscience behind their fictional control freak agenda is collapsing. You know, we had the article last week. Arctic sea ice expanding, polar bears thriving, emperor penguins thriving, Himalayan glaciers expanding, you know, coldest April in Britain for 100 years. So, but our houses need to burn for simply pointing that information out, apparently, according to Zwick. So I just say keep them coming. I mean, they're only discrediting themselves in the public arena with each successive temper tantrum that these climate alarmists have. And, you know, this is by no means the worst of it. People have called for putting skeptics up on Nuremberg war crimes trials, treating them for mental disorders, labeling them as racists. We had the 1010 Global organization with its satire ad showing kids who refuse to lower their carbon footprints being blown up in an explosion of blood and guts. I mean, there was an article today out of the Telegraph where this green Nazi control freak actually tried to say that climate change was a feminist issue. So again, everything to shift it away from the fact that, you know, the case is collapsing. That's why they refuse to debate the skeptics anymore. They just call for them to be strung up, put on trial, killed, houses burned down. And the fact is, these people don't care about real environmental problems. They're not concerned about the horrors that Monsanto are inflicting upon the planet. The eugenicists, they're the ones that are set to make all the power and money off the global carbon tax. And they're pushing a dogma that's anti-human. It seeks to demolish the very underpinnings of what makes a free and prosperous society. And they want to replace it with their scientific dictatorship, planned-opolist nightmare, which is why they're coming out with all these threats and intimidation that we need to shut up, otherwise we're going to be targeted as personally responsible when their whole scientific technocracy comes into being.